Hello, friend. What do you do when you've followed God's prompting and it seems to go absolutely nowhere or doesn't end up quite where you thought? Or perhaps you've looked back because you've been faithful and you've thought, what was the point of that? I want to tell you a story about a 3.5 hour drive, a speeding ticket, and a meeting that felt like a complete waste of time, and how it was only years later that I realised that God was doing something I couldn't see. Hello, and welcome to the podcast for Christian women over 50 who are navigating life's challenges and who sometimes wonder if their best chapters are behind them. Spoiler alert, they're not. Today I want to share one of those moments when I followed God's prompting and it seemed to go nowhere. Years ago, I was attending a church that decided to do something for people struggling with their mental health, and they were going to hold a sort of discussion forum after the Sunday service. It was a chance to talk about what was needed and what the church could do to meet the need. Now, I was away in the Peak District that weekend for a short break, but I really wanted to be there, so I finished my holiday early, drove all the way back, which was about 3.5 hours, and even managed to get myself a speeding ticket on the way. And I was so excited. I was expecting something spirit-led, a conversation about how God might want to move, or an invitation for people with a lived experience of mental health issues, like myself, to share what would actually help. But that wasn't what happened. The forum was taken over by mental health professionals, and I'm not saying that mental health professionals aren't valuable, of course they are, but this wasn't a conversation where the Holy Spirit seemed to be invited to speak. It was the experts giving their professional opinions about what was needed without even asking those with lived experience of mental health what they needed, and there was no sense that God might have something to say about it too. And I'll be honest with you, I sat there in that meeting feeling completely deflated. What a waste. All that driving for this. Now, at one point during that meeting, they asked anyone who had personal experience of mental health struggles to raise their hand. I raised mine. It was the first time I'd ever acknowledged publicly, yes, I struggle with my mental health. And I didn't think much of it at the time, because I was just so despondent and disheartened for days. And then when I received the speeding ticket, I asked God, what on earth was the point in all of that? But looking back, I think that all God wanted me to do that day was for me to raise my hand, to own my own story, my own challenges. But of course, that didn't make sense, and I didn't discover that until years later. Now, sometime after that, I was working for a small charity. My contract was coming to an end and I knew I'd be moving on soon, but still I was invited to an event where leaders of new and small Christian charities were gathering together to share their stories. Again, it didn't really make sense to go. I mean, I was on my way out of the organisation, but I went anyway. And one of the speakers at the event was a woman called Ruth, and she shared about her own mental health journey and how God had led her to start a mental health cafe at her church. It was such a simple idea. A safe space for people who were struggling. No pressure, no agenda, just a warm welcome and a safe space. And it had been so effective that she was now helping other churches to do the same thing. And something stirred in me as I listened. I wasn't in a church where this would make sense at the time I heard it, and I had no idea how it would ever be relevant to my life, but I had the strangest feeling, almost like a whisper, that one day, if ever I was going to start anything in a church, this would be it. And then that seed lay dormant for years. I moved on from the charity. I moved churches. Life happened, and I forgot about Ruth and her mental health cafe. Until one day, years later, when I was at a new church and I started to sense a gentle nudge. The Holy Spirit reminded me of that meeting with Ruth and the story she'd told. That maybe this was the place, that maybe now was the time. I wasn't sure. It felt presumptuous. I mean, who was I to suggest something like this? But a long time ago, I'd promised God that if I thought he was whispering something to me or telling me something, I would do my best to do it. So I mentioned it very tentatively to the vicar, half expecting her to dismiss it. But she didn't. She just said, "You should speak to Leslie." And it turned out that Leslie was already exploring the idea of starting something for people with mental health struggles. She wasn't completely clear on what it would look like, but she knew something was needed. So we arranged to meet at her house one evening to talk it through. Now, I have this thing I do sometimes when I really want God to speak and I want to calm my mind. I have a couple of playlists, faith songs, worship music, and I play them as I drive. But that evening, I didn't put a playlist on. I put one single song on repeat. It was No Fear by Carrie Job. And as I pulled up outside Leslie's house, it was dark, the song had gone quiet, and I turned off the car engine. Then, out of the silence in that dark, these words came through the speakers. Right now, anything can happen. Right here, everything can change. The timing and the silence before it, and the way those words landed in the darkness, just before I walked into a meeting I wasn't even sure about, with a lady I didn't know very well, it felt like God was speaking directly to me. And I stepped out of that car with a confidence that somehow God was in this, even though I wasn't quite sure how or what he was wanting to do. Leslie and I had a good conversation that night, but honestly, we weren't quite on the same page at first. But we agreed to go away and think about it. Eventually, it came together. We agreed to start a mental health cafe, the same kind of thing that Ruth had described all those years before. We got the okay from the vicar. We even got funding from the local council, and the Renew Cafe was born. The format was simple. Anyone was welcome. You didn't have to be feeling okay. It was a safe space for people who were struggling. No judgment, no pressure. We laid on activities, stone painting, colouring, simple crafts. We even assembled some chairs for the church one week. The idea was to give people something to do with their hands while they talked or didn't talk, whatever they needed. But God was at the centre of it all. We prayed before the meeting, and then we invited people to pray in the middle of it, but there was no pressure to join in. The prayers were simple, accessible. Another lady, also called Leslie, had a real gift for creating these prayers and printing them out with photographs she'd taken of the local area. They were beautiful. And people came. People who felt they couldn't go anywhere else. People who'd been struggling in silence. People who just needed to know they weren't alone. I look back now at that forum years before, the one that felt like such a big disappointment, and I do see it a bit differently now. It wasn't a waste. Raising my hand that day was the beginning of something I couldn't yet see. And Ruth sharing her story at that charity event, that wasn't irrelevant. That was God giving me a vision that would lie dormant until the right time. None of it made sense in the moment, but God was weaving it all together to bring about his plans and his purposes. I don't know about you, but over the years I've learned that God doesn't usually show us the whole picture. He gives us a piece, a prompting, maybe a seed, and sometimes he asks us to hold it, sometimes for years, until the time is right. And so often we think we know what he's doing. We think we're heading to Y, we have a plan, an expectation, an idea of how it should unfold. But God's purpose is so very often completely different from what we imagined. That thing that we felt was a waste of time, maybe he was planting something. The conversation that seemed to go nowhere, maybe that was preparation. That season that made no sense, maybe you'll look back one day and see exactly what God was doing. So if there's things that God's asking you to do that don't quite seem to make sense, just follow and be faithful and trust that in time things will make sense and you'll understand his purposes. But perhaps this story has reminded you of something that God put on your heart a long time ago that you've perhaps set aside. Perhaps there's a seed that's been lying dormant or a prophecy that's been spoken over you that you've almost forgotten. And maybe, just maybe, it's time to ask God whether it's time to pick it back up. Maybe this is the season. Maybe this is the church. Maybe this is your moment where right now anything can happen, everything can change. I could never have planned to start a Renew Cafe. I could never have predicted that a disappointing forum would have led to my raising my hand, that raising my hand would be the beginning of owning my story, that a woman called Ruth, speaking at an event I almost skipped and should never have been at, would give me a vision that I'd carry for years. But God connected dots I didn't even know were there. And I believe he's doing the same in your life, even when it doesn't make sense, even when you can't quite see where it's going. But what I find encouraging here is it's not our job to figure it out. Our job is just to stay faithful to his prompting and trust that he's taking us somewhere, even if it's not quite where we expected. If this story has resonated with you, I'd love you to consider sharing it or perhaps subscribing if you're not already subscribed wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're wondering whether your story still matters, I'd love to invite you to explore more in my book, Invisible Women of the Bible, that's out now on Amazon. It's full of stories of women just like you, women who've struggled, hoped, persevered, but were seen by God. But until next time, remember, God is connecting dots that you can't even see yet. And whatever season you're in right now, trust this: God is not finished with your story yet.